sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Join us on Thursday, May 9th in New York City for this year's Dissemination Dinner featuring world-renowned author and thinker Ayaan Hirsi Ali. A research fellow at the Hoover Institution, Ali was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people. She will be sharing her defense of the values free societies are based on, as well as her response to the forces seeking to undermine them. Sponsorships are available at buckleyinstitute.com/disinvitation 2024. Tickets to come.
I'd like to welcome our two guests for this week. Will Wang, a sophomore who's returning to Pod and Man at Yale.
Happy to be back.
And Ariane de Gennaro, say that right?
Yes.
A junior whose YDN columns I've read and appreciated for sometimes, even if I don't always agree.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about Yale's presidential search. Both of our guests have written about it recently, so I thought it'd just be a good idea to hear from you guys directly, maybe talk a little bit about the search, how it's been so far, where we are in the process. DEI is still determining a lot of these presidential searches. It's a big part of the search process, whether they're willing to admit it or not. We all know it. We all see it. People in the search committee know what's going on. People on the outside think, they're probably doing this, but people who are involved in the process see based on their understanding that DEI is a part of the search criteria. Ariane, you wrote about this in your recent YDN column. You pointed to Harvard as a cautionary tale. You called for a, quote, robust process rather than preconceived outcome guaranteeing a neutered process. What do you think Yale's doing so far in their process?
I think we're all aware that there's a lot of pressure from both students and faculty, which has been, reported on in the Yale Daily News, to consider DEI or diversity factors heavily. And I would be very surprised if they're not taking that into account in the search. So I guess what I would say is I don't think we're going to get a concrete answer as to what criteria is actually being taken into account, but we still should continue to voice what we would like to see in a president, which, what my piece was about is, I think my particular opinion on Claudine Gay is one that is shared by many people, which is that she simply was not qualified for the position in the first place based on her level of academic research that she had published, the plagiarism that was in her academic research, and finally the fact that she was unable to answer a basic question regarding the genocide of Jewish people. The point I was trying to make with the Claudine Gay piece is this is what happens when we presumably hold diversity supreme. And I suppose the only reason I'm glad that we don't know exactly what Yale's looking for is I think that's something that could also be weaponized in terms of everyone then fighting over, Yale said that they're going if Yale makes explicit what standards they're looking for, that's another thing that I think we're going to be going back and forth over. And I am hoping that the people on the presidential search committee have seen what has happened at both Penn and Harvard and can take into account that they should be making decisions based on who is most qualified for these positions. I think it's in some ways the silver lining is that we've seen what happens when you don't consider merit as the fundamentally most important quality for people in these positions. And so I guess what I would say is it's not necessarily most important that Yale makes the criteria explicit, but rather that we see that the committee is actually acting based on a search driven to find someone qualified and with integrity.
I did want to mention, since Ariane talked about the Harvard President qualification, I'm sure there are, people of whatever demographic you want who are academically qualified, right? But they have to be just that, academically qualified, or else we do end up with a situation like Claudine Gay. I mean, like, we had Drew Faust before her at Harvard, and what's happening at Stanford with his work of, I think, was it plagiarism or?
Yeah, plagiarism in some of his research, yeah.
Plagiarism. It's not just their academic competence, it's also their integrity as humans. And I think that might be a prerequisite before that. But I also do agree with Ariane. I don't think this should be a fully democratic process. Like, we should vote on the president, everyone gets to say, because then it becomes like this political campaign that I don't think will be good for the university. But to have some sense of what the university is looking for, such as like whether or not they're looking for someone who's been teaching for 20, 30 years. And I think that will be a good assurance for the rest of the Yale community.
Right. There's some in between, right? Where, you know, we don't need a vote on the next president. You know, I mean, there are a lot of alumni, I'm sure, you know, who would love a chance to vote on that. But I think even those alumni can kind of understand that Yale's going to have some level of an internal process. But I feel like Yale has gone to the extreme other side, released little to no information at all.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think your point is definitely correct that they theoretically, I think Yale should be able to find people from a wide variety of backgrounds who meet the qualifications of both academic merit and integrity. It just, the center of this search should be made explicit, and it should be based on what Will said, you know, integrity probably first and foremost, as well as general qualification, and any other considerations can be factored in but should be secondary.
So it's interesting that, you know, I was also hopeful, you know, when I saw what happened with Claudine Gay, to a lesser extent Liz McGill, that, you know, Yale in the middle of their search would see that as a cautionary tale and go like, okay, you know, free speech and how we treat different levels of speech is important. Like, people clearly care, the public cares, students care. But it doesn't seem like it's changed much about how Yale is doing their search. I mean, even the Yale Daily News had their piece complaining about the lack of transparency. They've gotten no answers, no direction, no instruction from the search committee. Buckley, for example, through Fight for Yale's Future, we've sent out letters, we've done our own survey, we did petitions with hundreds of signatures from alumni and students calling on Yale just to commit to free speech. You know, we just want to, you know, we think Yale needs a president who cares about free speech for its students. But we've heard nothing from Yale. You know, they haven't talked about it. It seems like an easy thing to talk about free speech and say that's a value. Why do you guys think Yale isn't opening up?
I mean, I'm assuming that Yale is trying to toe the line of, you know, if you open about free speech, I'm assuming people on the other side are also going to ask for someone who commits to DEI, right? And then Yale probably doesn't want to do either. I don't know if that's a good thing. I think it would actually be good to like lay down some values that we're going to align with, but I'm assuming Yale is trying to walk that middle ground at risk of offending anyone or everyone.
I think there is a Pandora's box that you can open up if you say we need a president who can commit to free speech. While I think it should be a nonpartisan issue, there will be people on both sides who are saying, now we need a president who can commit to, say, combating climate change on one side, or committed to defunding our support for, I don't know, Israel or another cause, whatever cause both sides of this aisle are passionate about.
Do you think there's some kind of middle ground where they could have said, well, I mean, Yale has the Woodward report, right? Those are Yale's free speech policies. So ostensibly, Yale could just say, well, these are our free speech policies. You know, every person we hire will believe in our official Yale policies.
Well, I think everyone on principle believes in free speech. It's just like what in practice, when there's a speech that offends you terribly, then that's when you toe that line. But no one comes out and say, I don't believe in free speech.
Sure.
I think that would be a little too totalitarian for even like any academic to admit plainly.
So I guess some of the sources you talk to, Will, people who have insight into the search committees, or who know people who are connected to people on the faculty and student advisory committees. Did you get any sense whether the people on those committees feel like they're having an impact on the search?
Oh, not at all. So they put it very bluntly. So they said that if they only did a 30-minute Zoom with the student advising committee, which just feels like something to pander to the Yale community. Hey, we did this thing. We performed this act. We don't care about your voice. But alas, we can write this off in an email and say that we do care about your voice. but it is in comparison with, I think, and I could be wrong, either Stanford, I think it's probably Stanford that has a search committee that includes students on it. So I think that might be a more direct process, but I'm not sure if what Yale is willing to concede to that.
Ariane, have you heard anything on that front?
Yeah, so I'm communications director of Yale College Council, or YCC, this year. And so I knew about the formation of the Student Advisory Council before we rolled out that decision to the student body. And, it was very excited to have some input, but just objectively, the process is that the Student Advisory Committee was formed, that they give advice, but there's nothing to bind the Presidential Search Committee to anything the Student Advisory Council says. So, I think in some ways it's good, right? You get the student feedback. I think that's great. It doesn't mean that advice has to be listened to at all. It's hard for me to say whether I think students should be having a direct impact on the process, I guess. I don't actually feel like I'm in a position to say specifically what we need in a president other than these broader value-driven statements that Will and I have been making. So, yeah.
Well, you're a student. Ostensibly the president does things that impact your experience, no?
Yeah, so I think there are things I can ask for that I want, but I don't think I should necessarily have a say in picking the exact person, especially because I'm assuming my peers have extremely different views from me on what kind of person that should be. Yeah.
So, guys, what do you guys think they should be looking for in the next president of Yale?
I think what the most appealing.
I know you just said you shouldn't have an opinion. Or
No.
Yeah.
I should have maybe in a broader sense. I think having some sort of stipulation of experience, I think, would be reasonable in terms of how time teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that because I think that's pretty objective. It isn't. It makes sense to me. I don't even feel like we should be at the point where we need to be saying, oh yeah, the president of a university should have a lot of experience. I thought that was implied, but clearly that's not implied. So I think we should make it explicit. I think that would be fine.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know about you. Well.
Yeah. I think a book wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, I agree.
Who's done enough research on a subject to actually talk about it. Of course, I think Ariane and I all have our biases. I wouldn't mind to see a humanities person there, but we, from our vantage point, it's hard to see what's best for the university, and that could be what you're getting at, Ariane. That we can only see what immediately benefits us as this particular kind of student. So perhaps again, a totally democratic process might not be the best process, but there are broad strokes of values we would like to say, like integrity and there's a word you used in your YDN article, merit. That very that I just forgot.
I guess it's a sad commentary on the university campus that you're so unfamiliar with the term merit.
Yeah, I had not heard the term in the classrooms.
Yeah, and I will just add, again, a rigorous process. I feel like going over the body of academic work that the candidates have produced, it seems like the Claudine Gay controversy could have been avoided if her work had been held to a standard that most college students are held to.
Right.
I think that the standard should be a lot higher than that, actually. But yeah, that seems like something that it would be very reasonable to demand from the administration. Just do a really good check to make sure this person is someone that we want representing the university and represents, the best of the best. That's
right. Do the basic checks so we don't get embarrassed.
Yeah. I feel like that should be part of the process. And I don't think that should be controversial or political. Maybe it is, but yeah.
So the Yale also, or I guess the YDN released the student survey this week. There are a number of interesting findings in there, things that students care about. There's a large number that care about the diversity of the university at large. But, Buckley is a free speech organization, so we're focused more on the free speech side of it. And there are a lot of students who cared about freedom of speech and academic freedom. And, it wasn't just a handful. There are a couple of questions about it, free response questions. There was one free response question. 1/3 of the results were about free speech. But when the Yale Search Committee sent out an email describing what they found in their search, they didn't mention free speech once. There are things about diversity in the university. They talked about fundraising, which didn't get mentioned by students. Surprise, surprise. But free speech wasn't mentioned at all in the email from the Yale Search Committee. Why do you think they would leave it out? not asking you to defend it, but I'm like, any idea why they...
This is just a guess, but Yale has been in a bunch of free speech scandals, and they may perceive it as if we defend free speech writ large, we may be giving some credence to some of these scandals and us not doing anything about it. But that's purely a guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I would assume as well. I think they're avoiding the word out of fear of sparking some sort of controversy. I do think, sorry if this is a bit of a tangent, but the interesting thing about the results of like the survey and the YDN is you have most people agreeing that free speech is important, but then most people also are agreeing that DEI is important.
Right.
And these issues, I think, are usually associated with like opposite sides of the aisle. But the other thing is, to Will's point, I think most people are just going to like, you're not going to be like, no, I don't care about free speech. Even with stuff like diversity, equity, and inclusion, like you're not going to be like straight up, I just don't care about inclusion. Like,
right. And I think like for a lot of people, one, they just, you know, even if you don't like DEI in its current manifestation, you like the idea of, you know, why not have a diversity population?
Exactly. So I think that's part of what it is. I guess free speech, for some reason, is more of a trigger issue, especially in the universities. I think that people associate with the right in a way that the mainstream, like, you know, the mainstream leftist like side of the university is really uncomfortable with. So that's probably why I was not included. I do think in a way saying fundraising is like the ultimate loophole, because then it's like anything that might offend alums and donors. Right. That's included in that. So I mean, it's a little bit, I think that's a pretty smart way to sneak in this very broad array of issues. But yeah, I think Yale's playing the careful political game with those kinds of omissions. Right. Yeah, and I also think post October 7th and the university response, I'm assuming Yale has been grateful for just not being in the spotlight of this controversy and seeing that. I think our administration and President Salave did a pretty good job, especially compared to our peer institutions, of avoiding that kind of controversies. I will say, I think Salave acted pretty quickly condemning the initial attack on October 7th, which maybe is a low bar, but is not one that was reached by some other of our peer institutions. And I think that is honestly a big thing. Yeah.
I think if you read his statement in comparison with, at least I've only read the other 7 Ivy League statements, it seems like he's the most forceful and most acerbic when it comes to, not acerbic, honest when it comes to pointing out that there is a right and wrong to what happened on October 7th.
Yeah, and that was true, you know, in the days after. It was like readily apparent that Salave's statement was the least equivocal, and it was, again, low bar, like Ariane said, but like he still passed it and you beat out the other universities, so that probably is something that kept him out of Congress. Yeah.
Right. I think it's fine for the president to just take a moral stance. Killing bad. And invest the much more nuanced geopolitics and the history of what's happening in the Middle East for students and faculty to engage with. I wouldn't have it the other way either, for them to cancel, like, you know, protest on one side or the other. Like, we are supposed to figure this out. If we are supposed to find light and truth, we're not supposed to have that handed in to us.
We had, to your point, we just had an event with Elliot Abrams, and there's actually a moment in there where 2 students, you know, came in and they were, you know, they came a little bit late and sat in the front row, and you kind of like, oh, showing up, sit in the front row, you never know what's going to happen. And they just got up, they asked very tough questions, and they were like clearly very passionate.
That's a good thing.
Very passionate on the Palestinian side. And that's what we want out of our Buckley events. You know, we want present aside and have it be challenged. Everyone in the room won, I think, because they heard a tough challenge and they heard an answer and they could judge whether it was sufficient or not.
Right. And good for them for being courageous enough to do that.
That's all the time we have. So I want to thank you both for joining me on Pod and Man at Yale.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you, Ariel.
Now with that, let's get right to our interview with Princeton University's Robert P. George, who spoke about overcoming campus illiberalism last Thursday, February 1st. Check out our website for more details. I'm pleased to welcome McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, Robert P. George. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Ari. Thank you for having me on the show.
So you're here in New Haven for a Buckley Institute talk on overcoming campus illiberalism. For some, this issue is new to them. It burst onto the forefront of their attention since October 7th. October 7th, you know, Hamas terrorist attack in Israel, and how campuses responded. But you've been watching this phenomenon, illiberalism, on campus for years now. Can you give us a quick overview from a professor's perspective I know, the state of free speech dialogue on campus?
The fundamental problem has been, throughout my entire career, the dearth of dissenting voices from the standard secular liberal orthodoxy on college campuses, certainly on my campus at Princeton. I think the same has been true here at Yale and at most universities around the country. Obviously, there are exceptions, especially among the more tradition-focused religious universities, although many universities that were once religious and some that continue to have a religious affiliation are marked by the same dogmatism, the same secular liberal dogmatism, what I call an orthodoxy, that you find in the elite academy, whether it's in the flagship state universities or in private universities like Princeton or Yale or Stanford or Harvard or University of Chicago. The lack of viewpoint diversity easily creates a milieu in which dissent is not only unusual, but is interpreted as unacceptable. In fact, interpreted, even experienced, as a kind of assault on the fundamental values of, quote, our community, unquote. The community constituted by those of us at this university, whether it's Oberlin College or Kansas State University or whatever it is. And that kind of dogmatism, that groupthink, that intellectual conformism, is simply antithetical to the mission of the university, which is the pursuit of truth, the advancement, the deepening of understanding, of knowledge. For that to be pursued, that mission to be pursued, Ari, you need an environment in which people feel free and are free to challenge each other, to examine any idea and subject it to the most intense intellectual scrutiny to see whether it hangs together and holds up or not. People need to be free and they need to feel free to question even other people's, even their own most cherished, deepest, even their identity-forming beliefs. Without that freedom, what you get is groupthink. What you get is conformism. Knowledge can't be advanced in an atmosphere or a milieu of groupthink and conformism.
Do you feel things have gotten worse in recent years than they were, I guess, beforehand?
I think people exaggerate the extent to which they've gotten worse, at least over my now nearly 40 years as an academic. I arrived at Princeton as a brand new assistant professor just out of graduate school back in the Middle Ages, fall of 1985. So I'm getting very close to 40 years in academia. And I think people do exaggerate how much worse it's gotten. And that's because it was pretty bad to begin with. When I arrived at Princeton in 1985, I was the only out of the closet, full-bore conservative on the campus. Now, we did have, on the faculty, we did have a couple of Republicans, but they would go out of their ways, especially if I was anywhere in the vicinity, to distinguish themselves from me.
I'm not one of those conservatives.
I'm a Republican. I remember my wonderful late colleague, Robert Gilpin, the great international relations scholar, who would, when the subject of politics and his particular political affiliation would come up, he would say, he was much older than I. Very, very eminent. He would say, I'm a Republican, but I'm not like Robbie George. I'm a Vermont Republican. He would describe himself as a Vermont Republican. In the old days, I guess you'd have called that a Rockefeller Republican or even a liberal Republican. So, we had that lack of viewpoint diversity even in those days. But while there was, I think, a lot of pressure to conform, and while there was some measure of intolerance of dissent, I think the thing that has gotten worse is the intolerance of dissent. Cancel culture, while not entirely a new thing, has become a much bigger thing. Sure. And it's a real thing. I mean, don't let anybody kid you about this. People have really been driven out of their positions in the academy. Carol Hooven at Harvard is a very, very good example, but there are many others for expressing dissenting views.
Nicholas Christakis here is our...
Oh, well, I mean, what Professor Christakis, one of the most eminent scholars in the country, in any field, to have been subjected to what he was subjected to, and his wife, Erica. I mean, that was an outrage. That was simply an outrage. And my understanding is, to add insult to injury, that his appointment as Sterling Professor, the great honor that Yale confers on its most distinguished faculty members, that was delayed for 2 years as a result of the controversy concerning really his wife, but which ended up involving him. So if I understand the story correctly, his appointment as Sterling Professor was delayed for 2 years, while at the same time, two of the students who very improperly berated him in the most uncivil manner were given awards.
It was for
at
graduation. Engendering racial harmony, I believe.
Well, I mean, it's just through the looking glass. This is Orwellian. But we see this all over the country. It's not just Yale, Ari.
Sure.
We really do see it all over the country.
So I guess there are two ways to approach this. You say who can do something about it, and where is the source of the problem? Is it on campuses? Is it leadership, administrators, the students themselves, the faculty, American culture? And who has the ability to make a difference?
Well, everybody has a role to play here. Citizens, because universities in our country, including private universities, rely on public support, not only public money, although in very many cases, including private universities, there's a great deal of reliance on public money. You probably have some idea of how much public money, how much government money, taxpayer money Yale University gets. It's a lot, and that's true of Princeton University and almost all other universities. Just a couple of universities don't accept government support.
Like
Grove City College, Hillsdale College, just a very small number. But it's not just the financial support; it's also the moral support. And the recent events that began with the terrible terrorist attacks by Hamas on innocent people on October 7th. That has undermined public support. The events that have come out of that, leading to the testimony of the university presidents before Congress, the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT, and then the fall of the presidents of Harvard and Penn. This has undermined the public's moral support for universities. And universities need that moral support. They need the financial support, but they also need the moral support. So citizens have a role here. But I think the real point of the spear where we can make a big difference in universities is students and faculty members who see the problem, whether they are themselves conservatives or not. And there are old school liberals who do see the problem every bit as much as those of us who are conservatives see it, pushing back, demanding, calling out the double standards. When those on the left or causes on the left or groups on the left are treated one way and those on the right are treated a different way, not given the same privileges, not given the same opportunities, not given the same standing, we need to call out those double standards. We need to be relentless in pushing administrators from undergraduate deans to provosts and presidents, pushing them on these double standards.
How much impact do you think the leadership does have on this? Like what?
University presidents?
Yeah, university
An enormous
presidents.
amount. I give you the knockdown evidence for
Please,
it.
yeah.
His name is Robert Zimmer, the late Robert Zimmer. Great hero of academia, mathematician himself, became president of the University of Chicago, and was president at the point at which cancel culture really became a very visible thing. And the minute a cancellation campaign organized against one of his faculty members, happened to be a geophysicist, very eminent geophysicist named Dorian Abbott.
Oh, we've had him on the podcast.
Oh, you've had him on the podcast. The minute that cancellation campaign was organized, Zimmer made very clear that, if I can quote scripture again, quote the Psalms this time, like a tree planted by the water, he will not be moved. So they could waste all the time they wanted pestering him to try to get him to get rid of, to revoke the tenure of, to act against, to discipline Dorian Abbott, but he wasn't going to do it. And the message came through loud and clear, and the cancellation campaign fizzled out because they knew it wasn't going to work. That's the kind of president you need.
Yale has the Woodward report, and it's actually the 50th anniversary this year. Right. Sets out policies, free expression, no opinion, too difficult to hear. There's a phrase that I'm blanking on right now that kind of encapsulates, the ideals that it pushed for free speech. But Yale isn't known for free speech. Chicago is. Chicago is the Chicago principles. We have the Woodward report, but everyone thinks free speech on campus, Chicago. So does that mean Yale hypothetically could have that kind of reputation if they had, Robert Zimmer as president?
Yeah, sure. It's a matter of leadership. I'll tell you another important ingredient: courage. Not just the courage of a university president to behave the way Robert Zimmer behaved. It's the courage of people who are willing to defy the groupthink and the conformism and speak their minds and publicly dissent from the orthodoxies and say, I'm going to stand up for what I believe in no matter what happens to me. I'm going to stand my ground. Like a tree planted by the water, I shall not be moved. We need a bit of that. Mm-hmm. We need a bit of that. Now, there are people at Yale who are like that. You've named one, the great Nicholas Christakis. But we need more. We need more at Princeton. We need more at Oberlin. We need more at University of Illinois. We need more at universities all over the country. Something I've learned in my 40 years in academic life, almost 40 years, is that I've been saying this for some time, and just yesterday I learned I heard David Mamet say the same thing. So I'm not sure if I'm plagiarizing him or he's plagiarizing me, but he said, and now I'm going to say something I have been saying for some time, which is that courage is contagious. When people see courageous activity, when they see courageous speech, they admire it, and it makes them want to emulate it. And it encourages them. It puts courage in them so that they will speak up.
So a lot of Americans are watching college campuses, especially the last few months, and might be losing hope. Any words of encouragement for them?
Yeah, I mean, you see that public pressure can make a difference. That should be an encouragement. But we're at this word has become overused. I'm going to use it anyway. An inflection point. We're at an inflection point. And that is a point at which things can get better, but things can also get worse. So what lessons should we draw, for example, from the testimony of the presidents in Congress, the presidents of MIT and Harvard and Penn, and the fall of the presidents, the collapse of the presidencies of Claudine Gay at Harvard and Elizabeth McGill at Penn? What lessons should we draw? I'll tell you what the wrong lesson is. The wrong lesson is that we need more restrictions on speech, or we need to extend the restrictions that effectively are on speech when it comes to some groups or criticism of some groups or attacks on some groups, verbal attacks on some groups. Extend that to other groups that aren't being protected, like so that speech codes prohibit anti-Jewish statements in the same way that they effectively prohibit anti-Black statements or anti-LGBT statements or what have you. That would be the wrong lesson. That would be more restrictions on speech rather than less. The right lesson is the opposite one. Let's get rid of the speech codes altogether. Let's have real free speech.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Pod and Man and Yale. That's all the time we have. So for those who haven't heard, who haven't listened to Professor George's talk, please check it out on our YouTube channel and give us a listen. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Ari. Thank you.
That does it for another fantastic episode of Pod and Man at Yale. If you haven't already, subscribe now. And always remember, for God, for country, for Yale, in that order.